the 6-year-old girl screamed into the pouring rain. "Bark, please, help me." No one answered, except a bark echoing from beneath the ground. No one owned a dog. No dog was seen in the yard. Yet that very bark summoned the neighbors who arrived just in time to save her unconscious grandmother. From that moment on, the little girl began speaking with someone or something no one else could hear. The wooden box carved with the image of a dog still sat untouched, unopened. But something was watching. Before we begin, don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss the next emotional and mysterious storytelling episodes from us. Under a heavy curtain of rain, Brisbane's outer suburbs lay cloaked in darkness. The wind screamed like an injured animal, hurling leaves, branches, and the remnants of old garden furniture across empty yards. It wasn't just a storm, it was a siege. Windows rattled. Power lines sparked. Somewhere in the distance, a transformer blew, with a thunderous pop, sending a ripple of darkness down the entire block. Inside a creaking wooden house that looked like it had been planted in the soil a century ago, and simply never left, a girl pressed her cheek into the soft, thinned flannel of her grandmother's nightgown. Chloe was 6, too old to cry every time thunder struck, but still young enough to believe the storm could tear the sky open and swallow them whole. She didn't sob. She just clung. Tighter. Every time the wind howled, she closed her eyes and pictured something softer. Her crayons, the smell of clean laundry, her dog, Plushie, with the one missing ear. Her grandmother, Elsie, didn't speak, didn't shush. She just held the girl in her lap, arms wrapped tight around Chloe's tiny shoulders, swaying slowly on the old rocking chair that moaned beneath their combined weight. Elsie had lived through storms. This wasn't the worst one. But tonight, something in the air felt different. Not the kind of different you could point to. It was heavier, like the ground was holding its breath. A sudden bolt of lightning lit up the entire room in stark white. For a fraction of a second, the silhouette of the giant tree outside their window, a massive old oak that had been in the yard long before even Elsie had arrived, loomed against the wall like a clawed shadow reaching across the floorboards. The thunder followed immediately, shaking the frame of the house. Chloe tensed. Elsie kissed the top of her head. "I think he's going to fall," Chloe whispered into the flannel. Elsie frowned. "The tree?" Chloe nodded. "He looks tired." They didn't speak after that. The storm raged through the night, relentless. Rain battered the tin roof like it had something personal to settle. The wind growled and twisted around the corners of the house as if trying to find a way inside. At one point, a sharp, cracking sound split the night like a gunshot. But Chloe had already drifted off in her grandmother's arms, the rhythm of the rocking chair beating back her fear until exhaustion took her. Morning came not with sunlight, but with an eerie stillness. The kind that makes you wonder if the world outside survived the night. Elsie moved like an old machine, slow, stiff, but determined, as she set Chloe down on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, and stepped out to inspect the damage. The yard looked like a battlefield. Fallen branches lay everywhere. Puddles turned to shallow ponds. The fence on the western side had collapsed under the weight of a neighbor's toppling pine. But the worst was at the center of the yard, where the great oak had stood sentinel for decades. Now, it lay broken, uprooted. Its massive roots clawed at the air like skeletal fingers. And nestled in the mess of roots, half buried and still damp from the rain, was something else. Something not made of bark or earth or rain. A small wooden box, about the size of a bread loaf, worn and moss-covered, yet bizarrely intact. Elsie squinted at it, not because she didn't recognize it, but because she did. And that recognition made something drop in her stomach. She didn't touch it, not yet. Chloe had padded out behind her barefoot, still wrapped in her blanket, eyes wide. "What's that?" she asked. Elsie didn't answer. She crouched, wincing at the pull in her knees, and brushed aside the mud and tangled root strands until the box was fully revealed. On the lid, carved deep into the wood, was the shape of a sleeping dog. Not a cartoonish one. Realistic. Curled in on itself with just the tip of the tail, poking under its own chin. There were no eyes, just hollows. It looked peaceful, ancient, and terribly alone. Chloe stepped closer. The mud squelched under her feet. "Can I open it?" No, Elsie said sharply, more forceful than she meant. Chloe froze. Elsie softened her tone. Not now. Let's get inside. But Chloe kept staring at the box. At the way the dog's ear was chipped like it had once been broken off and glued back on. At the way the earth beneath it seemed unnaturally dry, as if something warm had been resting there all night. The two of them went back inside. But Chloe kept glancing over her shoulder, like the box was calling her name in a voice only she could hear. That night after dinner, canned soup and toast, the power still out, Elsie lit candles and tried to keep things normal. She told a story about the first time she'd seen that oak tree, how she was just a young bride then, and her husband John had planted a small sapling there to mark the start of their new life. Chloe listened, but barely. Her mind was outside, on the thing in the dirt. She finally asked, "Did Papa John have a dog?" Elsie froze mid-stir of her tea. The spoon clinked against the cup. "Why do you ask that?" she said carefully. "I think it's his dog in the box." Elsie didn't answer for a long time. The candle flame trembled as if caught in the hush. "That's not something you need to worry about," she finally said. "But," I said, "no, Chloe." Chloe went silent. Later, when Elsie had gone to bed, Chloe tiptoed back to the kitchen and pressed her forehead to the window. The oak's fallen trunk was a dark shape in the night. But the box almost glowed. Not with light, with presence. Like it knew it had been seen. And now, it waited. Outside, somewhere in the dark, a low, soft sound rolled across the lawn. Chloe didn't jump, didn't scream. She whispered, "I hear you." And the sound came again, low, distant, but unmistakable. A single muffled bark from beneath the earth. Under the dim gray light of an overcast morning, Chloe stood barefoot at the edge of the uprooted oak. The ground was still damp from the storm, the air thick with the scent of wet leaves and unearthed soil. She wasn't sure what she was expecting, maybe something to change, to shift to glow like in those stories where magic made itself obvious. But the wooden box remained still, quiet, solid, mud-specked and unassuming, until she stepped closer. It wasn't loud. In fact, it was barely audible, more vibration than sound. A breath caught in the wind, a whisper curled at the edge of hearing. But it was there. A low, gentle ruff, like a dog exhaling through its nose. Chloe froze, looked around, waited for something else to follow. Nothing did. Just the silence of a garden, trying to pretend it hadn't just been torn open. She turned and ran inside. That afternoon, while Elsie napped on the couch, Chloe returned. She stood a full arm's length from the box this time, eyes locked on the carved dog. Her heart pounded. She took one step forward. "Ruff," it came again, a little louder. This time she gasped. She crouched down, pressing her ear to the soil near the exposed roots. The ground was cold and moist against her skin. For a moment she thought maybe it had been her imagination. Maybe she just wanted to believe something lived down there, something loyal and warm and real. But then came the third bark, sharper, closer, vibrating right beneath her ear like a knock from the other side of a locked door. That night she told Elsie, "I heard it again," she whispered over the dinner table. "Heard what, sweetheart?" "The dog." Elsie looked up from her soup spoon, paused midair. "What dog?" "The one under the ground, in the box." Elsie set her spoon down gently, like she was laying down a delicate truth. "Chloe, there's no dog under the ground. It's just an old box. Probably something your Papa John buried years ago and forgot about. But it barked. Sometimes when the wind moves through the trees, it sounds like all sorts of things. Don't scare yourself imagining nonsense." Chloe's voice dropped. "It barked when I got close, only then." Elsie tried to smile, but it looked more like a wince. "You've got a powerful imagination. You know that maybe you're meant to be a writer or an artist." "I am drawing it," Chloe said quietly. Elsie blinked. "What do you mean?" Chloe didn't answer. The next morning, while Elsie was out speaking to the neighbor about the fallen fence, Chloe sat at the kitchen table with her colored pencils spread in a messy halo around her. In front of her, a sheet of thick drawing paper. She wasn't drawing the box, or the tree, or even the yard. She was drawing him. She didn't know how she knew it was a him. It just felt that way. The same way she didn't remember ever seeing him before, and yet could draw him in exacting, unsettling detail. A large dog curled up the way the carving looked, except this one wasn't sleeping. His eyes were missing, or perhaps never there to begin with. Black hollows stared out from where his gaze should have been. Not gory, not violent, just absent. But the rest of him looked whole, majestic, like a guardian at rest. She shaded the fur in short, careful strokes, grayish-brown like ash mixed with fog. She drew the paws tucked under and the ears alert despite his stillness. Around him, she added something strange, roots wrapping around his form like protective vines. And from his chest, she drew a single thin line upward, curling out of the earth like a thread of sound. She titled the drawing in the corner, Shadow Bark. Elsie came home and stopped in the doorway. "What are you drawing there?" she asked, her voice too casual. Chloe turned the page so her grandmother could see. Elsie didn't move for a moment. Then she walked slowly to the table, pulled out the chair across from Chloe, and sat down with a small, almost imperceptible grunt. "Why does he not have eyes?" she asked. Chloe shrugged. "He didn't come with them." Elsie touched the corner of the drawing with her wrinkled finger. "This is very good, honey. But maybe draw something a little cheerier next time. Maybe the rainbow you saw last week." "He's not scary," Chloe said. "He's watching me." "But he doesn't have—" "He watches without seeing." Elsie looked like she wanted to say more. Instead, she stood up, muttered something about laundry, and disappeared into the back room. Chloe didn't stop drawing. By the third day, the barking had become familiar. Chloe would wake in the morning and step outside barefoot, careful not to touch the box and stand nearby. Sometimes she'd speak softly, asking how he was, if he missed anyone, if he liked the sound of the wind, or if it made him lonely. Sometimes he barked in response, sometimes he didn't. But always, when she stepped close enough, there was presence. One afternoon, she brought out a bowl of water and set it beside the box. The grass there hadn't started growing back yet, and the earth was still broken and cracked from the fallen tree. She placed the bowl down gently with both hands and whispered, "In case you're thirsty." She waited, no bark, but a soft wind stirred the leaves around the stump. She took that as a yes. That night, Elsie found a second drawing tucked under Chloe's pillow. She hadn't shown this one. It was different, more chaotic. The lines weren't as clean, the pencil strokes more aggressive. It showed the same dog, but standing now in a different posture. Not calm, alert, as if protecting something or warning something away. Behind him, shadowy shapes loomed, vague, human-like silhouettes with no faces. The background was darker, almost entirely blacked out with thick charcoal. And at the bottom corner, written in a child's careful block letters, "He knows they're coming." Elsie folded the drawing up, slid it into her pocket, and said nothing. In the following days, Chloe's behavior grew quieter. She still played, still laughed at the cartoons they watched together on Elsie's old TV set, but there was an edge to her now, a kind of listening beneath her smiles, as if part of her was always leaning back toward the garden. One morning, as she poured cereal, Elsie caught her whispering under her breath near the window. "What was that, hon?" I said, "Thank you." "To who?" Chloe pointed to the backyard. He scared the birds away. They were picking at the roots again. Elsie forced a chuckle. "Birds don't hurt anything, sweetheart." Chloe turned serious. He said they weren't just birds. That night, long after Chloe had gone to bed, Elsie returned to the yard. She approached the box for the first time in days. She stood before it with her arms crossed, heart pounding harder than it should. She crouched against her better judgment and placed her hand gently on the wood. It was warm, not the kind of warmth that comes from sunlight or retained heat. It was alive. She snatched her hand back and looked around as if someone were watching. But there was only the wind. And somewhere, faintly, so faintly, she almost convinced herself she imagined it, a single solitary bark, rose from the soil, curved through her ribs, and vanished into the night. Inside the house, Chloe slept soundly, cradling her drawing of the eyeless guardian in her arms like a beloved teddy bear. The next morning, when she woke, there was mud on the soles of her feet and a single perfect paw print on the windowsill. Under a sky smeared with low clouds and heavy silence, the night in Brisbane fell thick and absolute. The power had cut out an hour ago, with no warning, leaving the house in a pool of shadow. No hum of the refrigerator, no buzz from the old television, no faint yellow glow from the porch light. Just the rhythm of raindrops on the tin roof and the unsettling feeling that someone was still awake out there. Elsie had lit candles, one in each room, but the flames flickered like they were nervous. The air felt charged, as if holding a breath. Chloe sat cross-legged on the living room floor sketchpad, in her lap, crayons untouched beside her. She wasn't drawing. She was listening. It had started minutes ago, quiet at first. Footsteps. Not soft like slippers or light like a raccoon scampering across gravel. These were measured, padded, deliberate, like claws clicking gently on wet wood. They circled the house once, then again, paused near the back door, then the front. Chloe held her breath and glanced toward the hallway. Elsie had gone to bed early, complaining of a headache. She didn't hear it. Or maybe she did, and chose to pretend otherwise. Grown-ups were good at that, pretending they hadn't heard something because the truth of it was too strange to accept. Another step. This time outside the living room window. Then came the sound that made Chloe's stomach twist. A long, slow exhale. Heavy, measured. As if something large stood just outside the glass, fogging the pane with its breath. She crept to the window, her tiny fingers parting the curtain just enough to peek. Nothing. No shapes. No glowing eyes. No reflection staring back at her. Just the dark, dripping garden and the faint glisten of the wooden box under moonlight. But even in the stillness, she knew she wasn't alone. She pressed her forehead to the cold glass. "I hear you," she whispered. And from the other side, almost too quiet to register, came a sound like a soft growl, curling into a gentle yawn. The next morning, the world looked deceptively normal. Power restored. Birds chirped in the trees. Elsie whistled softly in the kitchen, the scent of toast filling the house. But Chloe couldn't shake the sense that something in the yard had changed. After breakfast, she walked out to the garden. The box sat undisturbed, but nearby something strange caught her eye. Her old jump rope, coiled neatly like a sleeping snake resting under the swing set. She hadn't played with it in days. It was supposed to be in the garage. She looked around. A small ball, her red rubber one, the one with the faded stars, sat halfway up the garden path, perfectly centered, as if placed there on purpose. And near the flower bed, 3 of her plastic toy animals stood in a row facing the wooden box like a congregation in silent prayer. She hadn't done any of that, later she told Elsie. But not the full truth. Not about the breath, or the footsteps, or the whispering noise behind the glass. Just that maybe something's moving things around at night. Elsie didn't laugh. But she didn't take it seriously either. "Probably possums," she said, sipping her tea. "Possums don't play with jump ropes," Chloe muttered. Elsie gave a small non-committal shrug. That evening, Chloe returned to the garden before sundown. She crouched by the box, careful not to touch it, and laid out 3 small twigs in a triangle on the ground beside it. "If you're real," she said softly, "put the middle one back tomorrow. Just the middle one, please." She didn't tell Elsie. She didn't even tell herself what she expected to happen. But the next morning, when the dew still clung to the grass like breath from the earth, Chloe ran out barefoot in her pajamas. The triangle was broken. The 2 outside sticks remained untouched. The middle one, however, had been placed across the top of the box, perfectly aligned with the dog carvings back. Like someone had left a signature. She didn't scream, didn't run. She sat down beside it, crisscross applesauce, and smiled. "Hi," she said. "I think I'll call you Shadowbark." That name felt right. Like it had been waiting in her mouth all along. From that point forward, she spoke to him daily. Not in long sentences, just little things. How school was boring. How the toast was too crunchy. How Elsie was getting slower and had trouble with the stairs. She told him about her dreams about the scary ones where the rain wouldn't stop and she was all alone. And sometimes when she paused, she swore she heard his breath again, soft and steady, like he was listening. One night she left him a drawing, a new one. This one showed a dog curled beneath the earth, surrounded by tree roots, his chest glowing faintly. Above him, she'd drawn her own face peeking down through the soil like a sun. She slipped it under a rock near the box and whispered, "You can keep it. I made it just for you." The next morning, the drawing was gone. Not torn, not chewed, gone. And in its place, a single paw print in the mud facing her. That night, the power went out again. Elsie grumbled from the kitchen as she fumbled for matches, muttering something about the electric company and how this neighborhood was always the last to be fixed. Chloe didn't answer. She stood at the window watching the yard waiting. No footsteps this time, no growling breath. Instead, the swing on the old rusted swing set began to move. Not fast, not from the wind. Back and forth, back and forth. A rhythm, controlled, like someone was sitting there. Chloe walked slowly to the back door and opened it. The night air was sharp. Still. She stepped outside, her toes curling against the damp wood of the porch. "Are you playing?" she asked. The swing kept moving. She smiled. "Can I play too?" And then, with no visible force, the second swing beside it creaked forward, then backward. An invitation. Chloe didn't hesitate. Elsie found her 20 minutes later, barefoot and whispering into the air, as both swings moved in perfect harmony beneath the pale moonlight. The old woman stood there for a long moment, her hand gripping the edge of the doorframe, heart caught in her throat. She didn't call Chloe inside. She didn't scold. She just watched her granddaughter, face lit with joy, speaking to empty space, as if she'd found the only friend in the world who truly understood her. Later that night, long after Chloe had been tucked into bed, Elsie wandered out with a flashlight. The garden was quiet again. The swing hung still. The jump rope lay limp beside the path. The rubber ball rested in a puddle of moonlight. But the wooden box, it had moved, only an inch, but enough to matter. And on top of it, scratched faintly into the grain of the lid, were 5 lines. 4 straight, 1 crossing. A tally. Of what? She didn't know. But as she turned to head back inside, a soft breeze blew behind her. And she could have sworn deep in the dark, from somewhere not far below her feet, a low sound rumbled like a warning. And a welcome all at once. The first syllable of a bark that never quite formed. Shadowbark was awake, and he was counting. The sun had barely crested above the treetops, casting long amber streaks across the backyard, when Elsie slipped on her worn garden gloves and stepped out into the soil. The morning was unusually quiet, no cicadas, no rustling breeze. Just the dampness of late spring air clinging to every surface, heavy with something unsaid. She hummed faintly, the tune warbling as she knelt down beside the newly sprouting tomato plants. Her knees ached, her lower back throbbed, but she found solace in dirt and silence. This garden had outlasted her husband, her sisters, her years in the city. It was the one place that still obeyed her hands. Chloe sat by the porch drawing. Her sketch pad rested on her knees, one hand gripping a dull blue crayon, the other tracing slow circles in the air like she was feeling for something invisible. Shadowbark was near. She could feel him. Elsie bent forward to reach for the watering can. She never made it. A quiet thud. That was all Chloe heard. No scream, no shout. Just the wrong sound of a soft body meeting wet soil. She turned. Gran. No answer. Chloe stood her drawing, falling face down onto the porch. Elsie lay twisted among the green, her right hand clawed at her chest, her mouth slack. The watering can had tipped, leaking into the dirt like blood from an invisible wound. Gran. Still no answer. Chloe ran, down the steps across the gravel path. The world slowed as her heartbeat climbed. It wasn't just fear, it was the sheer wrongness of seeing the strongest person she knew lying still like a fallen scarecrow. She fell to her knees beside her. Gran, wake up. Elsie's lips moved faintly. A whisper. A moan. But her eyes didn't open. Chloe looked around. The garden stared back indifferent. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know numbers. She didn't have a phone. Her breath quickened. I don't know how to help. She sobbed, once shoulders shaking, and then turned toward the tree stump, toward the box, her small fists clenched at her sides. Please, she whispered. Then louder. Please, Shadowbark. She looked back at her grandmother, then forward again. She screamed, Swati, Jupkan. The words tore from her throat like fire, and then sound. Not a bark, not a growl, a howl, long, deep, piercing, not canine, not mechanical, not human. It came from everywhere and nowhere, at once rising from the soil, vibrating through the roots, shaking the air like a distant siren. It was pain, it was alarm, it was summoning. Neighbors heard it first as a strange echo. Mr. Jennings, trimming his hedge 2 houses over, dropped his shears. Sandra Lynn, in her kitchen, turned off her blender mid-whirl. People stepped out of their homes, scanning the horizon for a runaway dog, a wounded animal, a trick of the wind. But there was no dog, no animal. Just a noise that didn't belong in their quiet corner of Brisbane. Chloe didn't move. She sat in the soil, clutching her grandmother's limp hand, her eyes wide, staring into the empty air where Shadowbark must have stood. And then, footsteps. Fast, familiar. Chloe. It was Sandra, breathless, vaulting over the garden gate. Behind her, Mr. Jennings shouted, "Call 000." Sandra dropped to her knees beside Elsie, eyes wide with shock. My God. Chloe, how long's she been like this? Chloe just looked down. She was talking. Then, she wasn't. Mr. Jennings appeared with his phone already dialing. A moment later, sirens were summoned, and the howl abruptly ceased. It didn't fade. It stopped, just like that. When the paramedics arrived, minutes later, Elsie was semi-conscious. Her pulse was weak, but there. They stabilized her, lifted her onto a stretcher, and rolled her toward the waiting ambulance. Chloe stood beside the porch arms, wrapped around herself, watching her entire world being carried away. A paramedic gently rested a hand on her shoulder. "She's strong. You got help just in time." Chloe didn't answer. She turned slowly toward the oak stump. The box still sat undisturbed, untouched, but the air around it shimmered, not visibly, not photographable, but present. As the ambulance pulled away, Sandra remained glancing over the yard, like she was trying to puzzle something out. "I could have sworn I heard a dog," she said. Chloe nodded. "So did I." Sandra looked around. "But where is it?" Chloe just pointed to the ground. "He's under." Sandra chuckled nervously. "You mean the dog's buried?" "No." Chloe's voice was steady, calm. "He lives in the dirt. That's where he listens best." Sandra stared at her for a moment, then gave a polite smile and mumbled something about getting back to her house. That evening, after the garden was empty, after the sun had dipped behind the neighbor's fence, and the birds had gone quiet again, Chloe returned to the stump. She knelt. She placed her hand gently on the box. "Thank you." The wood was warm, and from the ground, so faint it might have been her imagination, came one single bark. Sharp, confident. Then nothing. Chloe smiled. Shadow Bark was still listening. In the days following Elsie's collapse, the house felt quieter. Not in the comforting way like warm silence after laughter, but in the strange way where every noise feels like it's being measured. Chloe wandered the halls alone, the echo of her footsteps following her like a memory. Elsie was still in the hospital stable, but fragile. The doctors said she'd had a mild stroke. They used big words Chloe couldn't quite grasp, but she understood the weight in their voices. Now it was just her. Her, the wind, and Shadow Bark. She spent more time in the garden than ever. Not to play, not to draw, just to sit. She'd press her hands into the soil beside the box as if it were a heartbeat she could feel through her palms. And she would talk to him, not in a childlike way, but the way someone confides in a friend who doesn't need to speak back to understand. "I miss her," Chloe whispered one morning. "She hates hospitals." The light hurts her eyes. The box said nothing, but the wind stirred the trees, and a single leaf fluttered down, landing gently on Chloe's shoulder. That afternoon, Sandra returned with soup and a folded towel from the hospital. She lingered longer than usual, eyes drifting across the yard, her voice low. "You okay, honey?" Chloe nodded. Sandra squatted beside her. "Do you remember the night it happened?" "Yes." "You were very brave. You called for help, didn't you?" Chloe looked at the stump. "I didn't." "He did." Sandra followed her gaze. "Who?" Chloe pointed. "Shadow Bark." Sandra gave a tight smile. "Your imaginary friend." Chloe shook her head. "He's not imaginary. He's just not like the others." Sandra's expression tightened. "You mean he's a ghost?" Chloe tilted her head. "He's Earth." Sandra stood up slowly. "Okay. Well, if you ever want to talk to someone, I'm talking to him." Sandra didn't know what to say to that, but word traveled. Within days, murmurs began to ripple through the neighborhood. "I heard she talks to something in the garden. Maybe she's just coping." "No, I swear that night I heard a dog. I'd bet my fence on it." "You remember that story, the dog from house number 43? Chloe overheard them. They never spoke to her directly. They whispered when they passed, eyes shifting with curiosity they didn't want to admit aloud. But the name kept coming back. Number 43. That evening, curiosity and grief twisted together inside Chloe's chest like two vines choking the same root. She walked 2 streets down to the rust-colored house with the faded green mailbox. Number 43. The yard was tidy, too tidy. The kind of yard that no longer remembered children's laughter or the sound of paws on pavement. She hesitated at the gate, then pushed it open. The porch creaked as she stepped up. She knocked. Once, twice. A long moment passed. Then the door opened. He looked ancient. Not just old, but weathered like driftwood. Thin white hair, sunken eyes, but something sharp still shimmered beneath the haze. He blinked down at her. "You're Elsie's granddaughter." Chloe nodded. He glanced at her bare feet. "You're standing where he used to wait for me every morning." Chloe tilted her head. "Who?" Rexy said. "The dog." And just like that, the stories unraveled. He invited her in. The house smelled like cedar and tea. He poured her a cup of warm water with a sugar cube and sat across from her in a threadbare armchair. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The silence opened the door wider than words ever could. He was a mutt. Big, ugly, brilliant. Saved my life once, you know. We were in the shed during the '92 fires. I couldn't walk. Roof came down. Rex pulled me out by the sleeve and nearly bit through the door to get the neighbor's attention. Chloe's eyes widened. He barked like the whole world was on fire. He chuckled. Then his face changed. And then one day, he was gone. Gone. Just vanished. No hole in the fence. No collar on the ground. Like the earth swallowed him up. Chloe looked at the floor. "I think he came to us." The old man didn't laugh. He didn't scoff. He leaned forward. "Your grandfather, John." He took Rex's ashes. Didn't want him buried in a box. Said a dog like that deserved to be part of something living. He brought him to your garden. Planted that oak right on top. Chloe froze. "The tree." He nodded. "Yeah, that tree. That's where he buried the urn." Chloe's voice was barely a breath. "The box." He blinked. "You found it." She nodded. "I saw it the morning after the storm." He looked out the window, distant. Then maybe he came back. That night, Chloe returned home just before dark. She didn't tell Sandra. She didn't call the hospital. She walked straight to the stump. The box sat in its place. Chloe knelt beside it and laid both palms against the wood. "I know who you are now," she whispered. "You're Rex." For the first time, no sound came from the earth. No bark, no growl, no hum, only warmth. A heat that pulsed under her hands like a low drum beat. And then, ever so faintly, the grass around her swayed not from wind, but from movement. As though something unseen had stepped gently between the roots circling her in slow, loyal silence. She didn't move. She just whispered, "You're part of us now." From inside the house, a lamp flickered. The radio turned itself on, and in the distance, somewhere between the dirt and the breath of trees, came a single content sigh. By the second week of Elsie's absence, the house had gone quiet in a different way. Not just the quiet of no footsteps, or the missing creak of a kettle being lifted off the stove. This quiet was aware, as though the walls had started listening. Chloe no longer spent time in the living room or the kitchen. Instead, she lived almost entirely in the backyard. She ate her meals out there, curled on the swing or crouched by the base of the stump. She brought toys, books, a blanket. Each morning she laid out a slice of toast or a piece of fruit beside the wooden box wrapped carefully in a napkin. "Just in case you get hungry," she'd whisper. Sometimes the food would be gone the next morning, sometimes not. But Chloe didn't take that as a sign of presence or absence. She understood in a way children often do, and adults never can, that magic doesn't work on schedule. She told Shadowbark stories. About Elsie's first trip to the beach. About the time Chloe got caught drawing on the wall and blamed it on the cat, even though they didn't have one. About her favorite jelly bean flavor green apple and the worst black licorice. She read aloud picture books until her voice grew hoarse, and she played, not loudly. Not in the chaotic way children usually do. This was gentler, more like a dance with the invisible. She'd toss her rubber ball gently into the air and say, "Catch," and then turn around waiting. And sometimes, just sometimes, the ball wouldn't be where she dropped it. It would have moved slightly, shifted direction, rolled uphill. She didn't question it anymore. At night, the dreams began. At first, they were just soft colors. A wash of cool blue, the scent of mint and earth. Then came shapes flickering trees with glowing bark petals that drifted upward instead of falling down. And a garden. Not her garden, but a garden. Bigger, wilder, alive. She wandered it barefoot in her dreams, trailing her fingers along leaves that hummed softly when touched. The sky was never day or night. It shimmered with a kind of eternal twilight, like the moment between breathing in and out. And then came the sound. The bark, not loud, not threatening, calling. Chloe would turn in the dream and see him. Not the box, not the stump. Him, a massive dog larger than life, his fur flowing like smoke, standing between two blue glowing trees. His eyes were no longer empty sockets. They glowed gold deep and warm like fire behind frosted glass. His tail wagged slowly, thoughtfully, as if he'd been waiting a very long time. He never came closer. He never needed to. The moment their eyes met, Chloe always felt it a warmth, like falling asleep in the sun. Like trust. Like home. She always woke before touching him. Each morning the world felt thinner. It was subtle at first. A bird hovering mid-air longer than it should have. A shadow that shifted when she wasn't moving. A breeze that carried her name, not whispered, not spoken, but sensed. Reality wasn't breaking. It was bending. Chloe didn't tell anyone. Who would believe her? Besides, she liked it. When she blinked, she sometimes saw faint glimmers at the edge of her vision. Soft blue light leaking from tree trunks, or the outline of a tail brushing past the tomato plants. Once, as she sat in the grass, drawing a picture of her dream garden, she looked up and caught her reflection in the kitchen window. Only it wasn't her. It was her, but different. Wearing a crown of leaves, hands covered in paint, and behind her shadow bark, his massive head resting on her shoulder like a statue come alive. She blinked again, and the reflection was gone. That evening, she sat beside the box and whispered, "Are you dreaming me too?" The box didn't move, but the grass leaned in. Later that night, she dreamt again. This time the garden was brighter. The trees bowed gently as she passed, and the dog stood waiting, tail thumping against the glowing soil. She stepped forward closer than ever before. This time she wasn't barefoot. She wore a white dress that shimmered like fog. Her hands glowed, faintly pulsing in rhythm with the light in the ground. When she reached him, he sat. His eyes searched hers, and she understood somehow that he wasn't just showing her the garden. He was offering it. A place where grief was softened, where noise couldn't reach, where the broken things in the world turned green again. She reached out. The moment her fingers touched the soft fur between his ears, the ground beneath them pulsed like a heartbeat, like the roots of a tree speaking back. She woke with dirt under her fingernails, not dream dirt, real. She didn't scream. She didn't run to wash her hands. She just stared at her palms, then whispered, "Thank you for letting me in." Days blurred. One morning, she found a drawing she didn't remember making, a picture of herself, sleeping beside the stump, shadow bark curled around her like a protective flame. In the background, the sky shimmered blue, and the words written at the top in her handwriting read, "When the world forgets, the ground remembers." She hung it on the fridge. Sandra visited again, asked if Chloe wanted to go for ice cream. Chloe said no. Sandra asked why. "Because he's almost finished showing me." "Showing you what?" Chloe just smiled. That evening, the power flickered again. The radio turned on without warning, playing static that slowly morphed into a low hum, a tone that made Chloe's ribs vibrate. She walked outside and stood barefoot on the porch. The wind shifted, and then she saw it just for a moment. A path of paw prints in the dew-covered grass, appearing one by one, leading from the edge of the garden to the stump. They stopped at the box. Chloe whispered, "You're real in both places, aren't you?" She didn't wait for an answer. She sat down beside the box, curled up on the blanket she kept there, and let herself drift. Between sleep and waking, between here and there, between flesh and root. In her dream that night, she didn't walk. She ran, through glowing fields, past whispering trees. And when she reached Shadowbark, he didn't stand still. He ran with her. They raced through the light, their laughter echoing across a sky with no ceiling. And when she fell, he licked her face, and the stars above bent lower like they were watching. When she woke, her cheeks were wet, not from tears, but from something warm that had touched her in her sleep. The sheets smelled faintly of mint and pine, and a single paw print waited on her windowsill. Facing inward, under the cold breath of midnight, the house was utterly still. The moon hung heavy over the garden, casting pale light across the stump and the unmoving wooden box beside it. Inside, Chloe slept with her blanket pulled high beneath her chin, her tiny frame curled into a comma beneath the window. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was too deep, waiting as if the air itself had gone tense with anticipation. And then the sound, soft at first, metal scraping against metal. The back door. Chloe stirred, her eyes snapping open in the dark. Something was wrong. The kind of wrong she didn't need light to see. The air had changed thicker, more alert. She sat up slowly, heart beginning to pound. Another sound, a soft click. The lock. Someone was inside. The back door creaked open. The hinges moaned a protest, too familiar. Chloe froze. Footsteps, heavy, hesitant. 1, 2, then silence. She slid off the bed, tiptoed to the bedroom door, and pressed her ear against the wood. Nothing. Then suddenly a footfall on the wooden floorboards. Closer. Too close. Panic surged. She dropped down and scrambled beneath the bed, tucking herself into the darkest corner, pressing her fingers over her lips. Her pulse roared in her ears like a storm. The living room door opened. A shadow moved across the hallway, long and distorted. She could see boots, mud-caked, one foot dragging slightly. The person moved without urgency like he'd done this before. This was practiced, precise. The intruder turned toward the kitchen. The rattle of a drawer, then another. Silverware clinked, cabinets opened. The refrigerator door thumped shut again. He was looking for something. Not food. Something else. Chloe shut her eyes. "Shadow bark," she whispered in her mind. "Please." The man moved back through the hallway now toward the living room, closer to her door. He tried the knob. Locked. A grunt. Then a foot slammed hard against the wood. Once, twice, crack. The door burst open. Chloe bit her fist to keep from screaming. He stepped inside. She saw the glint of something metallic in his hand. Not a weapon, something meant to pry to break. He went to the nightstand, pulled open the drawer. Empty. Then he crossed to the dresser. The sound of drawers sliding, slamming. She couldn't breathe. Her chest rose and fell in quick, silent bursts. And then something shifted. Outside. It started low, barely a whisper. A growl. Chloe froze. The man did too. He turned his head slightly toward the window, frowning. Took a step closer. The growl grew louder, like a warning from the deep. Then a bark. Loud. Sharp. Close. He flinched, stepping back. Another bark. Then another. Suddenly a full-throated series of savage snarls erupted from the garden, furious, guttural, alive. It wasn't a dog barking. It was fury being given shape. The man spun toward the window, now backing away slowly. The barking came closer. The growls moved around the house, first at the back, then the side, then under the window, as if something massive circled the structure with impossible speed. He bolted. Chloe saw his boots pivot on the floor, scrambling toward the hallway. She crawled out just in time to hear the front door slam open. Then, a scream. Short, sharp. Thud. Chloe ran to the window. The man was on the ground, face twisted in panic, arms flailing. One leg kicked violently as if stuck, held by something invisible. The barking didn't stop. If anything, it intensified, coming from every direction at once. He yanked his leg free, rolled to his feet, and stumbled into the night, disappearing beyond the fence. Gone. The barking ceased. Instant, like someone had hit mute. Chloe stood frozen, her breath fogging the glass. Nothing moved. Then by the stump, a single shimmer. Blue. A soft flicker, then gone. She backed away from the window, heart still racing. But she wasn't afraid. She turned, looked toward the hallway. The door was cracked, hanging off its hinges. The room was ransacked, but she was safe. And she knew without doubt that she had not been alone. Shadowbark had come, had defended, had protected. She sank to the floor. Her body trembling, not from fear, but from relief. So powerful it felt like falling. "Thank you," she whispered into the night. Outside the wind stirred, and far beneath the earth, something loyal curled back to rest. The hospital room was quiet, but not peaceful. Monitors hummed gently, a rhythmic pulse of numbers and lines. IV fluids dripped in measured silence, marking time, in a space where time no longer obeyed clocks. Elsie lay propped up on the thin mattress, her cheeks paler than usual, her eyes ringed with the bruises of exhaustion and something heavier, grief or memory or both. The window beside her framed the late afternoon golden sunlight sliding across the linoleum. And in the corner, curled like a sleeping cat on the visitor's chair, Chloe sat, arms wrapped around her knees, eyes locked on her grandmother's face. Neither had spoken for a while. Elsie broke the silence first. "You shouldn't have had to be alone that night." Chloe didn't answer. Elsie shifted slightly, grimacing at the sharp pull in her ribs. "Sandra told me about what you said. About the barking." Chloe nodded, still silent. "About a dog that wasn't there." "He was there," Chloe whispered. "Just not the way they think." Elsie's lips pressed into a line, not disapproving, just full of weight. She reached over and placed her hand gently over Chloe's. Her skin was thin, papery, but warm. "I think it's time," she said, voice brittle. "Time I tell you something I should have told you long ago." Chloe looked up. Her gaze was steady, but behind it, hope, dread, and something else, understanding. Elsie stared at the window for a long moment before speaking again. "His name was Rex." Chloe didn't blink. "I know." That made Elsie flinch just a little, but she nodded. "He was a rescue," she said slowly. "Not rescued by us, he was the rescuer. John, your grandfather, found him during one of the worst floods in this region, back in '87. They said the dog had pulled 3 people out of a wrecked bus before the emergency crews even arrived." Chloe leaned forward slightly, her fingers twitching. "He saved people, more than once." Elsie smiled faintly, the corners of her mouth trembling. "He became a registered search and rescue dog, trained, certified. Worked alongside your grandfather for 6 years. He was brilliant, gentle, but when he was working, it was like he became the storm. He wasn't afraid of anything." Chloe's voice was a whisper. "What happened to him?" Elsie took a deep breath. "The night we lost John, there was a storm, a big one. Flash flooding, trees coming down. John was out helping. There was a call, a family trapped on the north edge. Rex went with him, as always." Her voice cracked. "They didn't come back." Chloe's breath caught in her throat. "They found John's body near the river." Elsie continued. "He was half buried in mud, but his hand was still holding someone else's. He'd gotten the mother out. She lived. And Rex," Elsie shook her head. "Gone. No body, no trace. But the locals, some swore they heard barking that night, even hours after the river had risen. Some said they saw paw prints in the mud that led nowhere." Chloe blinked back tears. "We searched," Elsie whispered, "for days, weeks. I never stopped. But eventually," she trailed off, "I couldn't bury him. Not really. But John had once said something to me years before during one of his quiet moments. He said, if love's strong enough, sometimes the soul doesn't leave. It finds a place to root, especially if it was never done giving." Chloe looked down at her hands, which were still dirty from the garden. She didn't mind. It felt right. "So you brought him back," she said. Elsie's gaze sharpened. "You knew." Chloe nodded. "The box under the tree?" Elsie closed her eyes for a long moment. "I buried his ashes beneath that oak, the one John and I planted when we bought the house. That tree, it was meant to be their place. John and Rex, together in the roots." Silence again, heavy, alive. "I never told you," Elsie said, voice thick. "Because I was afraid. Afraid you'd be scared. That you'd feel haunted. I didn't think that I'd hear him," Chloe finished softly. Elsie opened her eyes, met her granddaughter's gaze. "Yes." Chloe stood, slowly walked to the window, and looked out over the city. The sky was streaked with the colors of a fading sun, but her mind was already somewhere else. Somewhere deeper, earthbound. "He's not scary," she said. "Not to me." Elsie swallowed. "He spoke to you, not with words." Elsie leaned forward, the effort visibly painful. "Tell me." So Chloe did. About the barking, the growling, the ball that rolled uphill, the garden that shimmered blue in her dreams, the feel of his breath against the window, the way the grass moved when no one was there, the swing that swayed beside her, the warmth in the wood, the paw print on the windowsill. She told her everything. When she finished, Elsie's eyes were shining. "I never heard him," she whispered. "Maybe you weren't meant to," Chloe said. Maybe it's my turn now." Elsie chuckled, then winced. "I think he chose you." "He's still working," Chloe said. "Still watching." "Yes," Elsie whispered. "Still not done giving." They sat in silence for a long time. Outside, the day slipped into shadow. Then Elsie reached into the drawer beside her bed and pulled out a folded piece of paper yellowed with time, edges soft. She handed it to Chloe. "He wrote this. Your grandfather. I found it after he passed. I kept it hidden." Chloe unfolded it. The handwriting was rough, but strong. "If something ever happens to me and Rex survives, bury him under that tree. Let him rest where the roots grow strong. And if someone ever hears him, don't silence it. Don't call it crazy. Call it love." Chloe read the final sentence 3 times. then folded the papers carefully and placed it in her pocket. "I think he knew," she said. "I think he knew we'd meet." Elsie nodded. "And he knew you'd listen." As the hospital lights dimmed, Chloe leaned her head against her grandmother's shoulder. For the first time in weeks, neither of them felt alone. And outside, in a garden, miles away, the wind moved gently through the trees, not wild, not mournful, just present, like something faithful still stood watch beneath the soil. Under a sky swollen with black clouds, the air turned thick and electric, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Brisbane had seen storms before, but not like this. Not one that seemed to crawl across the city like a living thing seeking someone. Chloe stood in the garden, her head tilted to the sky as wind whispered warnings through the leaves. The light had gone strange, greenish, and heavy, and the birds had vanished hours ago. She knew it was coming. She felt it in her bones the way animals do before something breaks. Behind her, the house groaned under the first push of wind. The trees danced violently, bowing and snapping, and the wooden fence creaked like an old spine. Thunder cracked somewhere to the east, long and deep, like something splitting the sky in half. Then came the rain. It hit like fists, cold and wild, and Chloe turned running toward the shed behind the house. Not to hide. She wanted to grab the emergency lantern, the one Elsie always kept on a high shelf. She didn't trust the lights to last. She barely made it inside before the door slammed shut behind her with a heavy bang. And then darkness. Total. The shed had no windows, no light. Only smell, old soil, mildew, and dust. She reached for the lantern on instinct, climbing up onto the crate beneath the shelf. Her fingers grazed plastic, and she sighed in relief. But then snap. The crate wobbled beneath her. One leg broke. She dropped hard, the lantern clattering from her hand and skidding into the dark. She scrambled after it. Her fingers touched wood, then metal, then the door. She tried it. It didn't move. She pushed harder. Nothing. A board swollen with water had slid across the outside, wedging itself against the frame. The wind screamed outside, and water began to seep under the threshold, licking across the floor like the tongue of some ancient thing. Chloe backed up, panic climbing. She banged on the door with both fists. Help! But the storm ate her voice. Rain battered the roof. The floor grew slick. The darkness thickened. She stumbled, slipped, fell hard against the wall. Tears blurred her vision. Her breaths came short and fast. "I'm stuck," she sobbed. "I'm stuck, I can't." She crouched in the corner, hugging her knees, trying not to shake apart. Then she whispered, "Shadow bark." Silence. She pressed her forehead to the door. "Shadow bark, I'm scared." The shed moaned under the pressure of the wind. "I'm stuck, I can't get out." She waited. Thunder growled, and outside something shifted. Then a thud, directly against the door. She froze. A scrape, a groan, then another thud heavier. And then, with a sudden deafening crack, the board that had wedged the door burst loose and slammed to the ground outside. The door creaked open. Wind poured in howling. Rain splattered across her face. She didn't wait. She ran. Barefoot soaked, she sprinted across the yard as lightning ripped open the sky. Behind her, the door to the shed swung wide and slammed against the side of the building again and again, like something had yanked it open and then vanished. She stumbled into the house, dripping, shaking eyes, wild. The lights were out. The world was screaming, but she wasn't afraid anymore. She stood at the back window, her hair plastered to her cheeks, and stared out toward the stump. And for a moment, just a blink, she saw him, a massive shape, half shadow, half light, standing by the stump, head turned toward her. He didn't move. He didn't need to. She whispered, "Thank you." Outside, the storm continued. But inside, Chloe was no longer alone. The house was still. Too still. The clock in the kitchen had stopped at 3:14 a.m. Its ticking silenced, powerless, like every other electric thing in the home. Rain whispered against the windows in soft sheets, a storm passing, not raging. Outside, the air hung thick with the scent of wet earth and old roots. Inside, Chloe sat beside her grandmother's bed, watching her chest rise and fall in shallow, staggered intervals. Elsie had been slipping for days. No appetite, no color. Her voice barely a rasp. The doctors had said rest, hydration, hope, but hope was a tired word now. And Chloe had stopped sleeping. She sat curled in the wooden chair beside the bed, blanket wrapped around her legs, eyes wide in the half-light from a battery-powered lamp. Elsie's skin looked paper-thin, waxy. Her breath rasped, wet and uneven. Every few minutes, her fingers twitched, reaching toward something that wasn't there. Around 3:30, Chloe couldn't take it anymore. She slipped out of the room and padded barefoot across the cold floor through the kitchen out into the backyard. The storm had passed, but the ground still remembered it. Water pooled in uneven spots. The garden was soaked. Leaves glistened in moonlight. At the far end of the yard, the oak stump waited like a sentinel, and beside it, the box unchanged, unmoved. She walked slowly, her small feet squelching in the grass. When she reached it, she knelt. Her hands hovered above the box, shaking. "Please," she whispered. "She's tired." A breeze brushed her cheeks. "I don't know what else to do." Silence. She swallowed hard, tears starting to swell. "She doesn't talk anymore," she said, voice breaking. "She barely opens her eyes. I think she's forgetting me." She reached out and touched the box fingertips, grazing the worn carving of the sleeping dog. "I don't care if they say I'm lying. I know you're here. I know what you are." Her tears dropped onto the lid. "I know she's the one who buried you. I know he loved you. And I know she did too. And now She broke off, breath catching. "Now I need you to bark." She bent low over the box, pressing her cheek to the wood. "Please," she sobbed. "Just this once. Just one more time." She didn't move, didn't breathe. "I'm begging you, do something, anything." And then it started, a bark. One sharp guttural burst from deep in the soil, then another, and another. A full-throated warning cry rising like thunder through the earth. Furious, urgent, alive. The sound ripped through the garden, echoing off the fence, rattling windows. Then it came again, longer this time. A howl so loud and so relentless, it sounded like it wasn't coming from a single dog, but from every dog that had ever loved someone too much to leave them behind. Chloe sat back, stunned. The sound went on. 10 minutes, non-stop, barking, howling, calling, until lights began to flicker on in windows up and down the block. And then the front gate creaked open. Footsteps. "Chloe," a voice called out. It was May, Sandra's sister, the retired nurse, who lived across the street. She hurried through the backyard, breathless, her bathrobe flapping. "I heard a dog. Good heavens, it sounded like it was in pain." She stopped when she saw Chloe kneeling in the mud. "Are you okay?" "Where's your grandmother?" Chloe looked up, eyes wide and shining. "She's inside," she said softly. May didn't hesitate. She bolted through the back door. Chloe stayed outside. The barking had stopped, just like that, as if it had never existed. And yet the air still throbbed with the memory of it. Moments later, Chloe heard the panic in May's voice from inside. "She's barely breathing. Call an ambulance now." Another neighbor joined. Someone else shouted. But Chloe just sat beside the stump, staring at the box. "I heard it," she said, not to anyone, just to herself. "I heard it, Sua." And then she pressed her palm flat to the lid. Then it went quiet. She looked up toward the moon, which now hung low and full over the rooftops, casting silver light on everything below. "You did it," she whispered. "You called for help." Behind her, the flashing red and blue lights began to paint the walls of the house in color. Paramedics rushed through. The stretcher wheeled in. Voices shouted commands, monitors beeped, oxygen hissed. And as they lifted Elsie from the bed, one of the EMTs paused. "She's stabilizing. Just barely. Whatever happened, someone got here just in time." May looked at Chloe. "I didn't mean to come. I heard it. The barking. And I knew something was wrong." Chloe didn't answer. She was watching the box. It didn't move, didn't glow, didn't hum, but it no longer felt warm. It felt still, final. Later, when the house was quiet again and Elsie was safely at the hospital, Chloe returned to the garden. She sat beside the stump in her pajamas, the grass wet and cold beneath her, and she stared at the box. She placed her small hand over the carving. "I think that was your last one." The wind stirred gently. "I understand." She leaned forward and kissed the lid. "Thank you, Rex." No bark came, just the silence of something ancient, finished, at peace. Under the blue hush of early morning, the garden no longer whispered. No wind stirred the branches. No birds sang. The air hung suspended as if the world itself had taken a breath and chosen not to exhale. The grass, once constantly shifting under an unseen presence, now lay undisturbed. The swing set that used to creak softly in the absence of children stood still. And near the oak stump, the place where magic once hummed in silence, the wooden box rested quiet. But something had changed. Chloe noticed it first. She came outside barefoot and still in her pajamas and approached the stump the way she always did. But as she knelt beside the box, she saw it fine lines like hairline fractures crawling along the grain. Not from weather, not from rot. They were veins of parting. The box was starting to crack. She pressed a hand to its surface. It felt cool. Not lifeless, but distant like something that had once lived fully fiercely, but had now turned inward, choosing rest. She didn't cry. Instead, she whispered, "It's okay." From that morning on, the barking never returned. No more growls in the night, no howls carried on wind, no paw prints, no movement, only silence. But Chloe didn't call it absence. She called it peace. Something had been completed, fulfilled, and now whatever force once pulsed from beneath that soil had gone where it needed to go, leaving only memory and the soft echo of loyalty. Inside the house, her grandmother slowly began to recover. It started small, a few sips of tea, then a smile, then a moment of clear-eyed presence that wasn't there before. "Did he really do it?" Elsie asked one evening, her voice still gravelly but stronger than the week before. Chloe nodded. "You didn't hear it?" "I think I did," she whispered. "In my dream. I thought it was thunder, but then I saw him." "Saw who?" "Rex," she said without hesitation. "He looked different. Not old. Not like the last time I saw him. Younger, brighter. He just stood there, not saying anything. But I felt warm. Like I wasn't supposed to be scared anymore." Chloe smiled. That was him. Together they sat in the backyard for the first time in weeks. The garden had become ordinary, but it wasn't sad. They began to work again. It started with pulling weeds. Then came new seeds. Basil, marigolds, some sunflowers that Chloe had begged to try. And around the base of the old oak stump, they built a small ring of new saplings. Young green tender things that would take years to grow. But somehow that made it more meaningful. Each time they dug a hole, Chloe would glance toward the box, still resting in its usual spot, more cracked now, the surface softening like worn bark. Elsie noticed too. "You think he's leaving?" Chloe thought for a long moment. "I think he's already gone." Elsie nodded. But he stayed long enough. That night, Chloe brought out her sketchpad. For the first time in weeks, she didn't draw the dog with hollow eyes or wrapped in roots. She didn't draw storms or shadows or silent barks. She drew Rex, but not as he was, as she remembered him in the garden of her dreams. Eyes bright gold fur, glowing like firelight, tail curled in joy. She colored his paws in soft blue, gave him wings, not angel wings, but made of leaves and petals. She titled it Rest, and she pinned it on the fridge. As the weeks passed, the cracks in the box deepened. It never crumbled, never fell apart. But one morning, after planting the last of the new flowers, Chloe noticed something missing. The carved dog on the lid, its outline had faded. Not from erosion, from within. The carving had gone blank, as though the image had chosen to erase itself. She stood in front of it for a long time. Elsie came beside her, placed a hand on her shoulder. "What now?" she asked. Chloe looked up at her. "Now we keep going." And they did. Each day the garden grew stronger. And though they never heard barking again, neither of them ever felt alone. The morning began with the scent of cut grass and lemon oil. Elsie had finally felt strong enough to leave her bed without Chloe's help. She sat on the porch, wrapped in her faded knit cardigan, sipping warm water with a slice of ginger, while Chloe roamed the backyard with her usual quiet intensity, checking plants, rearranging stones, brushing loose dirt from the rim of the stump. The garden had changed, not just in shape but in feeling. It no longer buzzed with that strange alert quiet, no longer hummed with something hidden beneath the surface. It felt normal. Beautiful even. And yet Chloe knew Rex was still there. Not in bark or shadow, not in wind or dream, but in soil and story, in the very shape of how the light fell on the garden gate. She just didn't expect to hear from him again. Not until she found the box. Not the wooden one. This one was metal rusted at the edges, tucked in the far corner of the shed beneath a pile of cracked pots and tangled hose. Chloe had been looking for an old trowel when she spotted the edge of something square and silver. She pulled it free with effort. It clinked open reluctantly, hinges groaning in protest. Inside were mostly forgotten tools, shears dulled with rust, a coil of string, a mason jar filled with old nails. But beneath the tools, folded neatly and wrapped in a layer of wax paper, was a yellowing envelope. Her name wasn't on it, but she knew it was for her. It was addressed simply, "For whoever still hears him." Her fingers trembled. She opened it, heart thudding. The paper was soft from time, the ink slightly faded. But the handwriting was strong, firm strokes and narrow loops. She'd only seen once before, framed in an old wedding photo, her grandfather John. The letter read, "If you found this, it means I never got the chance to explain." That's all right. Some things speak louder through silence anyway. Rex wasn't just a dog, he was heart. muscle, soul. He was what held me together when the world frayed. People say dogs don't have souls. I think those people never loved one properly. I've seen Rex do things no living thing should have been able to do. I've seen him pull a child from a drowning car. I've seen him wait 3 days without moving for a man buried under a landslide. I've seen him look at a person and know whether they'd survive. And I saw him stay, even after I was gone. Even when his body was ash and dust. Love, if it's strong enough, roots. And if it roots, it remembers. The earth remembers. I buried Rex beneath the tree because I knew that if any soul could anchor to soil, it was his. Not to haunt, to protect, to warn, to be there when no one else could. I don't know who you are. Maybe a child. Maybe just someone listening. But if you're reading this, it means he spoke to you. And if he spoke to you, please know he chose you. That garden is sacred. Not because it holds bones, but because it holds promise. And when the day comes that his voice falls silent, that only means he believes you no longer need protecting. That you are the guardian now. Let the soil sleep. But never forget who watched over you. With all my love, John. Chloe didn't realize she was crying until the tears dripped onto her hands. Her throat closed. Her hands shook. She read the letter again, and again, and again. Every sentence felt like it had been meant for her all along. Words from a man she had never met, but who somehow knew exactly what she had needed to hear. She wiped her cheeks and stood. Then she walked steady, certain out of the shed, and toward the stump. The garden breathed gently around her. The birds sang. The wind stirred soft and unassuming. The box beside the stump was nearly half split now. Its wood curled slightly at the seams, like old bark beginning to flake. It didn't feel eerie or sad. It felt done. Chloe knelt. She placed the letter on top of the box, smoothing it flat with both palms. Then she whispered, voice trembling but sure, "He knew you stayed. He knew you'd protect us." She leaned forward, lips brushing the edge of the box. "Thank you for choosing me." For a long time, nothing happened. Then light, faint at first, a soft golden shimmer that pulsed from beneath the cracks in the soil. It spread gently like moonlight through fog, illuminating the earth around the stump, casting the garden in a strange holy silence. It didn't flare. It didn't burn. It glowed, warm, grateful, final. And then it dimmed, slowly, peacefully, until there was nothing but the garden again. And Chloe kneeling beside the box, smiling. Tears still fell, but they weren't from sorrow. They were from something much harder to explain, something purer. Fulfillment. Elsie came out onto the porch moments later, drawn by something she couldn't name. She saw Chloe still kneeling, saw the faint glimmer of light vanishing from the garden floor. She didn't ask. She didn't have to. She walked down the steps and joined her granddaughter, kneeling slowly beside her. Together they watched as the last ray of light melted into soil. And all that remained was mourning, and memory, and love. The crowd had mostly thinned. Banners still fluttered in the breeze, half lit by the fading gold of a Brisbane sunset. Tables with empty coffee cups and congratulatory flower bouquets stood like quiet witnesses to something larger than celebration. The small courtyard nestled beside a white brick building, newly painted and trimmed with ivy, buzzed only with the soft chatter of a few lingering volunteers. At the center of the courtyard stood a bronze sculpture, modest in height but full of life. It showed a dog-eared, alert body, mid-step mouth open in an eternal bark frozen in motion, among etched vines and flowers. At its paws engraved into the stone were the words, "Where love takes root, loyalty never fades." Behind the statue, the freshly unveiled sign read, "The Rex Sanctuary, Center for Rescue and Rehabilitation of Stray Dogs." Chloe stood at the front, no longer the small girl with dirt-stained fingers and wide listening eyes. She was in her 30s now, calm, tall, composed. Her voice had carried with quiet power as she'd addressed the crowd an hour earlier, speaking not from memory, but from belonging. Every syllable had been rooted in something that couldn't be taught, something only lived. And I know she'd said to the circle of guests that some things never truly leave us. They only change shape. They shift from bark to breath, from pause to purpose. They become part of the garden we grow inside us, around us. There had been silence after that, then applause. Now the speeches were over. The cameras had left. The donors had shaken hands, offered hugs, whispered kind words before driving off. The children had chased each other into tired laughter, and the last puppy adopted that morning now snored happily in its new owner's lap somewhere beyond the gate. But Chloe hadn't moved. She stood with her hands folded in front of her eyes, fixed on the sculpture. Years had passed, but the weight of what had begun in a flooded garden had never left her. She didn't speak of it often. Not the truth, not the roots. Most people wouldn't believe her. But here, surrounded by people who believed in what came after, she didn't have to convince anyone. She could just remember. Behind the building, beyond the garden fence, the remains of the old property still stood. The house had been sold and rebuilt. The yard had changed. But the tree stump remained. She'd had it preserved. It was hollow now, softened by time, filled with soil and growing ivy. But its center was sacred, untouched, at the very heart of the new sanctuary. Chloe walked alone, her heels crunching softly on gravel as she moved behind the main building. No one followed. No one called out. The garden was smaller than before, but carefully kept. Vines lined the brick wall, flowers bloomed in raised beds, and at the back, under the silver-blue shimmer of dusk, stood the stump. She approached slowly. Her fingers touched its edge, rough but familiar. A breeze stirred the leaves overhead. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "I did it," she whispered. There was no reply. Only the rustling of distant trees, the call of a magpie far away, and the hum of street traffic softened by distance. She smiled anyway. "I kept the promise." Her eyes drifted to the base of the stump. There, half hidden by moss and creeping ground cover, was a small stone, unmarked, smooth, warm to the touch. She crouched and ran her fingers across it. "I know you're gone," she said. "Really gone." Silence. "But I also know that every bark I heard was real. Every whisper in the dirt. Every moment you stayed after you didn't have to." Her voice trembled. "Thank you for holding on until I didn't need holding anymore." She stood slowly, letting the silence settle again. The air was cooler now, the sun nearly gone. She could hear the faint sound of a radio playing from one of the staff rooms, a gentle hum of music. She turned to leave, and then it happened. A sound, not loud, not sharp, familiar, from the base of the tree. One bark, low, steady, deep. She froze, turned, no one there, nothing moved. But it had happened, a single bark, the same tone she'd heard as a child in her dreams, in her panic, in her healing. It hadn't been imagined. It hadn't come from her memory. It had come from the roots, from the soil, from him. She stepped back to the stump, knelt, placed both palms flat against the moss. Tears stung her eyes, not from sadness, from recognition. "Goodbye," she whispered. There was no second bark, no glow, no shift in the air. But something had passed between them. Something final. Something sacred. And as the last of the daylight vanished from the sky and the soft wind carried the garden into night, Chloe rose, turned, and walked back to the sanctuary. Behind her, the stump stood still. But in the wind, just for a moment, the echo of a bark rode the breeze one last time, then disappeared, forever.